Welcome, friends. I am Leif Winnar, the faculty director of the McCoy Family Center for Ethics in Society, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to the 2025 Wesson Lecture. The Wesson Lectures were endowed to bring America's most prominent scholars to campus to reflect on democratic governance, and we are so honored to be joined tonight by Alison Gopnik, professor of psychology and affiliate professor of philosophy at Berkeley. It's hard to believe that anyone here does not already know Professor Gopnik, perhaps through the dozens of scientific texts she's written, perhaps from her column in the Wall Street Journal, her articles in the Times, the TLS, the NYRB, or her frequent appearances on television and radio. More than any other public intellectual, Professor Gopnik has educated us on how children think. And to read her truly brilliant books, like The Philosophical Baby or The Scientist in the Crib, is to experience such a cascade of pleasures. The pleasures not only of learning about child development, but getting insights into one's friends and family and colleagues and perhaps even oneself. And then just the sheer pleasure of being in the presence of such a powerful thinker who also knows how to frame a metaphor and to tell a good story. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Professor Gopnik. Professor Gopnik will be joined in conversation tonight by Professor Juliana Bedata-Nure, now Professor of Philosophy at NYU, and before that, a deeply valued member of my own department here at Stanford, where she is missed terribly all the time. Professor Bedata-Nure has done path-breaking work on what justice requires between people at different stages of life. She has a continuing research program on how to understand the deepest forms of today's social inequalities. And when she was at the McCoy Center here, she was a pioneering leader of the Stanford Basic Income Lab. So Alison will begin with a presentation of around 25 minutes. Then Alison and Juliana will be in conversation for around 20 minutes. Then we'll have a good amount of time for us all to discuss the ideas together. And finally, you will be very welcome to join us for a reception after the event. Please join me in welcoming the 2025 Wesson Lecturer, Professor Alison Gopnik, to explain the biology, philosophy, and politics of caregiving.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm going to venture away from the podium. I want to start out with this picture. This is a picture that we have in our special issue of Daedalus that came out. It's from Gabriel Metsu, who's a part of the Dutch Golden Age in 1660. And it's really a remarkable picture. It's remarkably compelling, both as an illustration of care. This is a mother taking care of a sick child, but also as something that calls out our own impulses to care. I think it's very hard to look at that picture without wanting to do something to help that child. And that's in spite of the fact that the child looks sick. The child is not a pretty happy, healthy child. That is definitely a sick child. And this picture has even more resonance when you realize that 1660 is when the plague was rampant in Amsterdam. So not only is this a sick child and a mother, this is a child who is very likely to die. And a mother who, as a result of her care for that child, is putting her own life in jeopardy as well. And that emphasizes the fact that care has these really distinctive characteristics as human social relations go. And that's a point that I'm really going to be emphasizing in this talk. Now, to go from the sublime to the completely banal, yesterday I spent an hour trying to figure out a good senior living place for my 90-year-old parents who live in Berkeley, and then I spent another hour talking to my son about my 4-year-old grandson who's having a really hard time and having temper tantrums, and what could we do to help him get through this. Everybody has that being a deep part of their day, a deep part of the things that they're committed to. And if you ask most people, even empirically, what's the things in your life that have been the most morally deep, the most morally profound, both the most difficult and the most satisfying, the places where you've had the hardest moral dilemmas to solve, they'll talk about care. They'll talk about the way that they had to take care of their parents or their spouse or their children or the other people around them. So this is a really deep, profound part of human nature, and yet it's largely invisible in the social sciences. So if you read economics, if you read political science, these kinds of relationships, when they do show up, sort of show up on the periphery. They're certainly not central. And to take just a very simple example, that kind of care that you see in that picture I just talked about doesn't show up in GDP. So all the things that people do to take care of the people around them are invisible from an economic perspective. If you read moral psychology, moral philosophy, in spite of the fact that this is so foundational, again, only around the borders will you see people talking about care. They'll talk about harm, they'll talk about justice, they'll talk about exchange, as we'll see in a minute, but they don't talk very much about care. There's an interesting exception, which is that back in the 70s and since, feminist scholars recognized this and said, wait a minute, why is nobody talking about care, and have sort of made proposals about a care ethics. But aside from just saying this is important and we should be paying attention to it, that project hasn't kind of spread to the rest of the social sciences in the way that you might expect. And you could ask a question. Margaret Levy, the political scientist and the head of CASBAS, has been my co-conspirator in this whole project. As we read through one literature after another, here's the 5 basic moral principles that humans engage in. There's nothing about care. Here's the 5 taxonomy of the fundamental 5 social relationships. Nothing about care. And we found ourselves saying, is there anything that all of these people who are saying this have in common that might explain why they're not paying any attention to care? And we finally decided they're tall. That's the thing, right? They're too tall to actually see the children that are at the bottom. So what we've been trying to do and I have to say, I've been guilty of this. I've been in cognitive sciences and thinking about development and thinking about children for 40 years now, at least. And again, although there's bits and pieces around the edges, this really fundamental question about the way that we care for other children is not something that I started investigating until relatively recently. So in 2023, a bunch of us got together and decided that we would like to remedy this situation. We'd like to bring together all of the people in the social sciences who are involved in caregiving. And if you're interested in reading more, this is a paper that I wrote in 2023 in a special issue of Daedalus that was about a new moral political economy, where there are ways that we could change the way that we do political economy that would appreciate things like, would appreciate a wider range of human values. And I had an article in there about caregiving, and that was the inspiration for a 2-year project, which is continuing at the center, about the social science of caregiving more broadly conceived. And this is an issue of Daedalus that just came out, the Journal of the American Academy, with a wonderful, amazing list of people from psychology, biology, philosophy, political science, economics, essentially all of the social sciences, talking about religion, theology, all talking about care and trying to get a sort of general picture of what's going on in care. I highly recommend it. And this is the result of a series of workshops that we've done that are continuing, trying to pull together a sort of central social science of care. And the neglect of care is especially striking. Sorry, make sure I put my timer on here. The neglect of care is especially striking because, from a biological perspective, one of the things that's most striking and characteristic about human beings is that we have a very distinctive kind of care. And indeed, just forget about human beings for a while. One of the things that's most characteristic about different species, a very central idea within evolutionary biology, is what's called life history. And life history is about things like how long a period of childhood you have, how long you live in general. And one of the central ideas in life history is something called parental investment. How much care are members of the species applying to other members of the species, especially to children, but in general. And what comes out of this is that there's a really striking correlation between how much of this parental investment there is, how much care there is in a species, and to be a bit anthropomorphic, how smart this species is. Certainly how large a brain they have, how adept they are at learning, how flexible they are in different kinds of environments. And this is a really striking relationship that doesn't just apply to mammals, it even applies to birds. That's the first place that people thought noticed it. There's even arguments that it applies, say, to insects. It seems to be a very general sort of biological principle relationship between how long a period of childhood there is, how much care there is, and how sophisticated the cognition of the adult animal is. One of my favorite examples of this actually comes from marsupials, who are otherwise farish away from humans. But if you look at these two species of marsupials, the one on that side is a quokka. The quokka, both with the cutest name and incredibly cute features. Quokkas live on a little island in Australia. And the quokkas have both males and females involved in taking care of the young. And the babies stay in the mother's pouch, like kangaroo in Winnie the Pooh, for as long as a year to 2 years. So they spend a long time in the pouch. And you can contrast this, and there's only one baby born at a time. You contrast this with a Virginia possum. It's about the same size, also a marsupial, and the possums have big litters of 7 or 8 babies, and the babies are mature very quickly, and the mother is the only one who really is involved in caring for them. Now, I think for humans, we probably often feel more like the possums than we do like the quokkas. We could all use more backlighting in our lives. But as we'll see, we're actually much more like the quokkas. In fact, we're way out on the distribution on all of these kind of life history characteristics. Why might this be? And I've written at some length and in complicated ways about why this might be. But let me just give you an example of one study that suggests why this might be. This is one of my favorite studies in all of psychology. Here's a really basic Psych 101 finding. You put a rat in a maze, the rat goes down one arm of the maze and nothing happens. It goes down the other arm of the maze, it gets shocked. It will never go down the arm of the maze that led to the shock. As I say, Psych 101. Except it turns out there's an interesting exception to this. That's true for adult rats. If you put a juvenile rat in the maze and it goes down and it gets the shock, it will go down and get the shock again. So it actually seems to prefer to go down the arm that's leading to the shock, which seems very surprising unless you have 2-year-olds or teenagers, in which case it seems quite predictable, right? But there's an interesting catch to this. So why would this be? Well, of course, if you think about it, it makes sense not to go down the arm that leads to the shock. But if you never go down that arm, you're never going to learn that the environment has changed. So there's a fundamental tension people in computer science call the explore-exploit distinction, where if you explore, you're going to get more information, even at the cost of your immediate utilities. But in the long run, that actually is going to lead you to thrive and lead you to do better. So here's the interesting catch in this story. The baby rats will only go to the shock if the mother is present. In fact, even if just the mother's smell is present. People have done very elegant experiments about this. So if the mother's smell is present, then you'll go to the shock. If it isn't, then they'll act like the adult rats and avoid the shock. So there's something in this case about just the presence of a caregiver that enables a kind of exploration and learning that wouldn't be there otherwise. And Nim Tottenham showed that this is also true with 3- and 4-year-olds. And I think there's a lot of evidence we've been collecting some in our lab, that this is very much true for humans. And not just true for childhood, but true in general. And in fact, as I said, if you think about human beings, we're way out on the end of the distribution on all these elements. We have the largest brains. We're, again, anthropomorphically very good at learning and intelligent. And we have a much wider range of care and caregivers, and always have since we evolved, than our closest primate relatives do. So we have pair bonding. So we have males, husbands, fathers who are attached to wives and are involved in caregiving. And only about 5% of mammalian species for only about 5% of mammalian species is this true. We have my personal favorite, which is grandmothers. If you look carefully behind those 3 beautiful grandchildren, you'll see there's a grandmother lurking in the back. And there's been, Kristen Hawkes and others have pointed out that even in forager cultures, women live for 20 years past menopause. It seems sort of paradoxical. Why would you have this very long period of elderhood? And of course, men for free get the same period of elderhood. And there's quite a lot of evidence that elderhood is very important, particularly important for care. So the survival of the babies depends on the care and resources that are being given them by the grandmothers and the grandfathers as well. And that's true for the only other closely related species we know that has postmenopausal grandmothers, which is orcas. And you see the same thing with orcas. I can talk about the orcas a bit later on. And of course, the other thing that this grandmother is doing is she's actually reading a 100-year-old copy of Winnie the Pooh to these children. So she's also passing on 100 years of cultural information, and there's a lot of evidence that the elders are serving that same function for humans in particular. So we have this very wide range of caregivers for children. And we also have what the great anthropologist Sarah Hrdy, who's been part of our group at the center, calls alloparents. These are people who are not direct kin, but who are nevertheless deeply involved in caring for children. Again, as long as there have been humans, we've done this. In most cultures, we do this much more than we do in our culture. In our culture, this tends to be paid professional caregivers, but in all human cultures, people beyond immediate kin are involved in caring for the young. So we have a wide range of people who are involved in care for children in particular. But not only that, we also have a wide range of people who are cared for. And it's interesting if you look at, so we care about and care for our partners. We actually go out and think that we need to take care of them as well. And in the case of partners, there's actually beautiful neuroscience which shows, for example, that prairie voles seem to adapt the kind of neural mechanisms, even the chemistry, that leads to care of the young from biological mothers. And the same kinds of mechanisms are used to make attachments between the voles. So the prairie voles are, again, one of these rare pair-bonded species. The males and females treat each other in some ways a lot like they would treat the babies, and the mechanisms for doing that seem to be very similar and contrast the prairie voles with other species of voles. And we also, as I said, we have this extended life, we have this extended period of elderhood, and that's an interesting kind of double-edged sword, because on the one hand, those elders are providing care, but on the other hand, they need care. And that's something that's become particularly relevant and vivid in the last few years in the United States and indeed globally. So elders, and we provide care for elders, even though elders are not necessarily going to be able to reciprocate. I like the examples of students and patients because that's a nice example where we treat teaching and medicine as if it was a kind of instrumental activity often, and particularly politically we treat education and medicine as if they were utilitarian kinds of occupations. But I think anyone who's actually had students or anyone who's taken care of a patient recognizes that this is also a relationship of care. It isn't just an instrumental thing about, okay, I'm going to go and put knowledge into the head of this person or I'm going to fix them. And I should say, when I'm trying to persuade tall people that care is really important, I find that talking about graduate students is a good dimension. If I get people to reflect on their relationship to their graduate students, that gives you a sense of the complexities of a care relationship. But we don't just extend our care to other people, we also extend it to things that aren't our immediate kin or people who are close to us at all. So we extend it to people who we're providing global aid for, or at least we used to in the United States. There's a wonderful essay in the Daedalus about caring for the dead who can no longer care for themselves. Caring for animals, caring for the natural world. And often in religious traditions, this kind of care is a sort of central idea. And one of the things that's been really interesting recently is thinking about how this care might be extended if we ever have AI agents. I think we're going to have a responsibility of care that will be similar to our responsibility of care to others. And there's a podcast with Ted Chiang. I highly recommend this novella of Ted Chiang's, which is one of the best descriptions of care that I think I've ever read, about what our care obligations to AI might be, and we can talk about that maybe later on. Okay, so that's to say the biology is such that care is really, really important for human beings. What do we mean when we say care? If I'm saying these are all relationships of care, is there some way to characterize those relationships that makes them different from other kinds of relationships? And what we've been doing in this project is trying to sort of do the same thing for care that utility theory does for economics or game theory does for political science. Try and get a very general, formal account of what it is that characterizes care, and then try and get some consequences of that. And in fact, Mike, who is here, and others who are in the room are going to be part next week of a workshop at CASBES at the center about computational models of care, something that's been completely absent, completely new territory. All right, so let's think this is like a kind of philosophy sketch of what a model like this might look like. Think about two agents. Agent A has different resources and goals than agent B. What happens? You've got two agents, they've got different resources, they've got different goals. What's going to happen as a result? And the fundamental idea in all of utility and economics and political science is that they're going to be able to exchange. There's going to be a social contract. I'll give you resources to get your goals. You'll give me resources to get my goals. And that means that we escape from local minima and prisoner's dilemmas, and we all are better off than we were before. And that's an unbelievably, incredibly powerful idea. And it's the idea that underlies a tremendous amount of economics and political science. Another thing that you could do is you could have a solidarity relationship. So maybe what happens is instead of exchanging, you just pool resources and goals. So you're not thinking and not being worried about, you're not worried about who's going to get what or tit for tat. You just put things together. Another thing, sort of from another political tradition that you could think about, maybe this is more like a kind of Marxist view, is, okay, well, if A has more resources than B, what's going to happen is B is going to subordinate their goals to A. So if I have power over you, you need something from me, then you will do the things that I want rather than the things that you want. But care doesn't look like that at all. What happens in conditions of care? Think back to that picture of the sick child. In care, A has more resources than B, so it has some of the same structure as a power relationship, but now it's reversed. Now the very fact that the other person is needy is the thing that leads you to give them resources. And what I want to argue is that's a very general characterization of care. It applies to care for children, but it also applies to care for elders. It applies to care for the dead. It applies to all those examples that I gave you of care relations. It's an interesting puzzle about why do we have this kind of social relation, but it is a social relation. And again, I think it's worth pointing out those first four actually, the first three actually come from work by Alan Fiske, who's given this kind of taxonomy of social relationships, which he describes in these terms, but the last one doesn't show up there. So care is not something that he describes. And care has some, maybe just a brief thing to mention is that, I think care is really wonderful, as you can probably already gather, and I think most people think care is really wonderful. But care has negative sides as well, and this close relationship with power it can give you a sense of why it's very easy for care relations to turn into power relations. There's a reason why paternalism is called paternalism, right? That it's hard to, that's a potential block that comes when we're trying to figure out how to give care. And here's another complexity. I said that the structure is that the carer is using their resources to accomplish the goals of the cared for, but what goals are they? Like, how can you characterize those goals? You know, a simple thing to do would be to say, okay, it's their objective utilities. What would be good for the cared for person? And a lot of care is like that. You're making peanut butter sandwiches, and you're, you know, cleaning up the bedpan, and you're doing things that will make the person better off. But sometimes those objective utilities might actually be in conflict with subjective utilities about what is it that the cared for person actually wants. And that's a constant dilemma in the context of care. Should you be doing the thing that will make the person better off from your lights? Should you be doing the thing that will make the person happier from their lights? So, you know, if I have to listen to Paw Patrol to give a recent example with my 4-year-old, right? There is no doubt that in terms of subjective utilities, Paw Patrol is like at the top of my grandson's subjective utilities. Is it really in his objective utilities? I'm not sure. It's definitely not in my objective utilities. But then there's an even more subtle aspect of care, which is that a lot of times what we're doing in care is not either helping with subjective or objective utilities. What we're trying to do is give the person resources that will let them decide on their utilities themselves. We're trying to give them autonomy or empowerment. We want to give them resources that will let them decide what the things are that they want and need and what their goals should be. And this is very vivid if you're thinking about, say, teenagers, where that's exactly the agenda that you have. But it's equally true if you're thinking about something like taking care of elders, where, you know, the kinds of issues about, well, should dad says he wants to keep driving, but should he really keep driving? And what could I do that would make it possible for him to accomplish the goals that he wants? That's a very fundamental thing that comes up. And if you think about students, or if you think about students, or you think about patients, it's the same kind of thing, same kind of thing that comes up. She's not here at the moment, but one of my really distinct, wonderful students recently shifted from a PhD in developmental psychology to a PhD in philosophy at Stanford. She was studying modal logic today, so she couldn't come to this talk. But as her student, I would not have suggested that she go and do a PhD in philosophy at Stanford, but that was what she wanted to do, so I did everything I could to give her the resources to be able to do that. There are other features of care that make it really different from other kinds of social relationships. You know, the asymmetry between the two people and the kind of intrinsically altruistic character of care, the fact that it isn't reciprocal, it doesn't require reciprocity, make the relationship extremely distinctive. But there's also other, at least characteristic, if not necessary, characteristics of care. So things like the fact that care is very often local. It's not something that applies unless you're, you know, a bodhisattva. It doesn't apply to everybody in the world. It might be a kin relation, but it could just be a friend. It could be someone who, for some reason, one reason or another, you're committed to caring for. And often it comes with this kind of affective charge, as in that picture that I showed you at the beginning. It's love, right? I mean, that's the thing that is involved in caring. Care and love are very closely associated with one another. And it's got this kind of transparent commitment. So once we're committed to the person, we'll care for them, even if, as in the case of, say, an elder, the person is hardly the person that we originally knew, and the person is difficult, and it's going to be hard to interact with them. We're still committed to the idea that we should care for that. We should care for that person. And a very interesting characteristic of care, even neurologically, is that it is, in fact, the act of care that leads to that committed sense of care. So my slogan about this is, we don't care for people because we love them because we care for them. And Sarah Hrdy's latest book, which is called Father Time, has beautiful examples of this with fathers, where it's actually picking up the baby and smelling the baby and being involved and engaged with the baby that leads to both brain and behavioral changes in fathers that makes them into carers for the babies. Okay, let me switch now to thinking about what does this imply for, so the main argument I want to make is care is complicated, interesting, general, and very different from the kinds of relations that we typically think about and talk about in the social sciences and in politics. And that we should be doing the same kind of rigorous work to try and understand it that we would want in other areas of the social sciences. Let me just talk a bit about politics. So if you're thinking about, just from a broad perspective, as I'm sure everyone here knows, there's a sense that we have this crisis of caregiving politically at this moment, and it's a crisis that's gone on for quite a long time. And when you ask people in questionnaires, for example, the thought that care is really important and that we would want to do things to support it is amazingly bipartisan, even in this polarized environment. Everybody says care is important and we should do more to support people who are caring. And yet it keeps not happening, right? So it keeps being that everyone says that it's important and it would be really good politically if we did something about it, and we keep not doing things about it. Why is that? Why is it that we can't seem to translate this into political action? There's lots and lots of reasons. But I do think part of it is this conceptual gap between the way care works and the typical ways that we think about politics and political philosophy. In the same year, as it turns out, that Gabriel Metsu was making that beautiful picture, Thomas Hobbes was writing Leviathan. And again, this is like the origin story for the social contract picture. And the social contract picture depends on this idea of reciprocity, of tit for tat, of a kind of justice that comes from me doing something for you and you doing something for me. And that just doesn't apply to the case of care. In fact, in some ways, it's sort of constitutive of care that it doesn't have these requirements for reciprocity. It's interesting that you do get a different philosophical tradition, the tradition of Mengzhi in the Asian tradition, in the Confucian tradition, that really does politics very differently. So the way that it does politics is to say, let's start from these close relationships of care, and what we should do in a politics is scale those up to, the size of China, right? But even though that seems, and Eric Schwitzgebel in that Daedalus issue has a lovely essay about this, even though that seems like a good idea, it's very hard to see how you could scale up, whereas the whole history of liberal democracy and the Enlightenment is scaling up social contracts to the level of an entire planet. But it's very hard to see how you can scale up the fundamental care relationships. But it does feel like that's what you should do. And let me end by saying, in fact, the great inventions of the social contract, the great social inventions, are markets and democratic states, right? Those are things that come out of the idea of the social contract. Those are ways that you can scale up social contracts to a larger scale. Neither of those are very good mechanisms for ensuring care. Markets, when care comes out of markets, it ends up being a very poorly paid profession, a very poorly paid kind of work, simultaneously a very poorly paid kind of work and a very expensive luxury, consumer luxury. And I think this is part of the reason why people feel under the gun economically. It's even though, flat screen TVs are cheaper, taking care of your father or taking care of your child is more expensive, and that doesn't seem to be changing in a market economy. On the other hand, if you think about what states do, very characteristically, what states can do is get professionals to serve some function that's important for the people who are in the state. So we have professional soldiers who help to defend us all, and that's run by the state. In civilized countries, you have doctors and medical systems that are run by the state and serve everybody in the state. We have teachers who are funded by the state to go out and take care of, to teach people. We have, et cetera, et cetera. But even though, it has to be said, states could do a much better job of supporting childcare than they do, and most civilized countries do a much better job than the United States does, you still feel as if it's not quite right to say what I really want is to be able to go and get a professional caregiver for my father and not have to spend any time with him after that, right? Or, It's not true that I'd want to say, I want to send my child to a kibbutz and not be involved in actually caring for them. So there's something about this kind of locality and affective quality that comes with child care, that comes with care relations, that seems to be really important and that isn't easily captured by the usual sort of state mechanisms. So last slide, what could we do? What are things that we could do that go beyond the kinds of mechanisms of markets and states? And this is just a beginning inventory. One thing that should be dear to the people who've been thinking about, Oh, there we go, okay. One thing that should be dear to people thinking about basic income is that we can just do cash transfers. We can do things like child tax credits and family allowances that actually enable people who are caring for children at least to have resources. But we could do that for people who are taking care of elders, or we could do that for people who are taking care even of friends, people who are they're not directly kin with. People could be, and I think should be, receiving direct resources that will enable that to happen. Another thing that we could be doing is changing the infrastructure. So the way that we organize housing, for example, makes it very difficult for people with different generations or people who are caring for one another to be in the same place. And when I was just in Montreal, they have these wonderful triplexes that my grandchildren are actually in. And you can see how that kind of structure, there's a triplex, there's 3 apartments, and then there's what they call a ruelle, a little courtyard in the back, is a kind of natural way of leading to care in a way that the single family house in the suburbs is not. And Caitlin Zaloom has some examples of that in The Daedalus. A particular favorite of mine is the extension of the institution of marriage. Marriage is one of maybe the only institution we have that legally affirms care relationships, right? So it's a way of saying, if you enter into this relationship, you are committed to care for this person, and that will come both with benefits, privileges, and responsibilities. But, I have to say, as someone who's approaching 70, grounding these fundamental relationships in the erotic ties between people, I guess I could say, especially the erotic ties between men and women, but maybe just the erotic ties between people in general, is probably not the most stable basis for, any kind of extended social relationship. And it certainly has turned out not to be a great basis for doing things like caring for children or caring for elders. So one thing is we could have both formal ritual relationships like marriage for one of the children who decides to take care of the elders, or for someone who's committed to a friend who otherwise wouldn't have those kinds of resources. And just as in the case of marriage, we could associate that with both privileges and responsibilities and resources. And of course, it's interesting, godparents are kind of like a classic example of trying to set up those kinds of relationships, and they've sort of fallen into disuse. And finally, let me give just a little practical example that I like. If you think about preschool, for example, universal preschool in California, one of the problems with universal preschool is getting the right ratio between kids and grown-ups, right? It's really hard to have this right number of people to take care of kids. We rightly say that if we want to have preschool, we should have trained early childhood education teachers. But we could also just have an older person who wants to be the grandmother for that class. So you could set up that local relationship between that particular person and the kids in that classroom. As a way, and that person is not going to be a teacher, she's going to be a grandmother, or he's going to be a grandfather. He'll be an elder who's serving all the kinds of functions that elders have served. So I think with imagination and thought, and in the context of understanding more about care, we could actually change the policies, move the policies in a new direction that would let us actually make progress in this fundamental human enterprise of caring for each other. And speaking of care, let me end with my acknowledgments. Margaret Levy and Zach Ogolnik, who co-edited this with me at the center, have been absolutely central to this, and I've had a wonderful set of postdocs. It's been supported by the Sloan Foundation, interestingly, their economics program, Danny Goroff in particular, and especially by the Templeton World Charity Foundation. And I just was going to mention my parents and my 7 grandchildren, great niece, who are the inspiration for this entire, project and giving me examples of the complexities of it every day. Okay, let me stop there.
Well, thank you so much to the Ethics and Society team for inviting me. It's always a great pleasure to be back. And thank you so much, Professor Gopnik, for this really interesting presentation. I think as a parent of 2 young children, the Paw Patrol example resonated with me very highly. I guess I wanted to start with a simple, I guess, clarificatory question on the scope of care and this notion that care, like the generality of care. So there's a sense in which we might think of care as being everywhere, at the center of almost everything we value. And yet it seemed in your presentation at times that there's this other of care. There are other relationships that are not caring relationships. And so I guess my question, it's going to be hard to not fall into the normative discussion right away, but I guess more descriptively, I'm wondering if you could say more about what care isn't and what are the limits of care in our society. So it's general, but there are things that aren't care. And so I was trying to think about, a lot of your examples, of course, are about childcare and elder care, parents, grandparents, teachers. There's also the example of doctors. I kept on thinking about artists and museum workers and library workers, all those people who perform a care function for our children as well. But then I was also thinking about housekeepers and cooks and all those people who do something for us and care for us in other ways. So I guess if you could say something about what isn't care, and maybe, and this is where we fall into the normative question, should we seek to extend care to everything in our life, or are there limits even to what we?
So I think there's 2 things to say. So markets, right? Market relationships. If I'm, clicking on Amazon to get the widget that I need for the new light bulb that I need for my lamp, and I exchange money for someone else to give me that widget, I don't, aside from the sort of universal theological bodhisattva sense in which I care for everybody, I don't feel as if that relationship puts me in a care relationship with the person who's selling me the light bulbs, right? And, after all, market relationships are foundational to economics, right? Political relationships are another example where I could be in a coalition that I was just thinking about this today. I could be in a coalition with another university to, protect us from federal intervention. And I don't necessarily have to really like Harvard, right? I don't necessarily have to feel like I have a deep duty of care to Harvard to feel like, yes, it would be good to enter into a coalition with them in order to be able to accomplish certain kinds of ends. So I think those are some examples. Now, one of the things that's very interesting and tricky is what happens when you've got a professional caregiver. So when I have a nanny, or if I have a cook or a care worker or a healthcare aide, is that a relationship of care or is that a relationship of exchange? And obviously it's both. And one of the interesting old observations in labor economics is that those professions are very characteristically underpaid. And there's at least an argument that part of the reason why they're underpaid is because there is this kind of intrinsic motivation to care for people. An example that I find sort of heartbreaking is during COVID, when you heard the interviews with these healthcare workers who are, incredibly underpaid, incredibly overworked, going into the nursing homes where people were dying, and said, well, why are you doing this? And they'd say, well, it's Mr. Smith. I've been taking care of Mr. Smith. I couldn't just go and leave him and, not be caring for him. So there's this really interesting question about what happens when you have care and market relationships being entangled with one another. And I don't have any answer to that. I think that's one of the things that we really have to think about more.
Okay. Okay, that's very helpful. Because of course we could think about bringing the model of care and the values of care into the world of business and into politics, and that would be kind of a related question, but it would go further than.
Yeah, that's the Mengji picture.
Yes.
And I don't know, I mean, I think probably having relationships that are, as an urban person, this is something that comes up with my husband who comes from a small town. I feel like I don't necessarily want to talk to the Uber driver, right? Like I'll say thank you very much for the nice ride, but that's he or she is giving me a ride and I'm paying them, and I don't necessarily feel like all of those relationships have to have the kind of quality that a care relationship would have. But I think it's a really interesting, I think trying to think about how could Mengji's project work is a really interesting question.
Okay, so then a bigger question, I guess, is about thinking about so I completely agree with you that questions of care have been so marginal in all the dominant frameworks for thinking about what we owe each other.
Right.
And in listening to you and in thinking about this issue, I've been wondering the extent to which thinking about some of the issues you mentioned as matter of social justice also get us to some of the same conclusions, policy-related conclusions. And yet, I have a feeling that still you've convinced me that something would be missing if we were to approach those issues primarily. So I just wanted to try to kind of highlight some of the directions we might go in if we focus on justice and see what might be missing there. And maybe those are, in fact, the frameworks that incorporate care the most. So maybe they're already doing part of the work that you want those frameworks to do. But I still have this intuition based on your talk that something's going to be missing. So the first would be to think about gender justice, of course, and think about the importance of providing, ensuring equal opportunities for women who get burdened by caregiving responsibilities, both for their children and aging parents often, and thinking about their diminished ability to pursue other plans in life, right? So that would be one framing for thinking about how we should incorporate the importance of care in our economy, in our political economy. And relatedly, this question of ensuring that gender asymmetrical lifestyle are not more costly than gender symmetrical lifestyles, right? That those that decide to go away from the dominant norm aren't forced to live worse lives, right? Then there's the issue of age group justice, right? Which I've been really interested in, and which is really about providing opportunities for all age groups, but also paying attention to specific forms of marginalization, segregation, isolations that might happen at different points in life. For young adults, it might be we might worry about political marginalization. We might worry about marginalization from labor opportunities, where, especially after financial crises, where young adults tend to be unemployed at really high rates. And then for older members of our community, it could be spatial segregation. It could be the risk of violence and infantilization in context of institutionalized care. And then finally, there is racial justice and thinking about domestic workers who are disproportionately women, disproportionately Black, disproportionately immigrant, disproportionately non-citizens. And we might think about what to do to empower those workers and ensure they have more bargaining power, more exit options, more rights, right? So I guess I'd love for you to say something about both how this connects with what you're saying. It seems like it connects with it very much, but also what might still be missing in looking at those issues primarily from through the angle of social justice and equality.
Yeah, so I think that, I'm a sort of Isaiah Berlin value pluralist, so I think it's really important and fundamental to human life that we have different values and goals simultaneously, and they trade off against one another. That, that's Berlin's, basic tragedy, is that we can't maximize all of our goals at the same time. We can't maximize all of our values at the same time, and values are genuinely in tension with one another, and that's a deep part of human life, and also I think a deep part of liberal democracy is the idea that liberal democracy should be preserving the idea that people could have different values and that those values could trade off against one another, that you don't just have a sort of single utopian dimension of good for people. So justice is an incredibly important value. So the contractual values about if I do something for you, you should do something for me, that we shouldn't have unequal power values, all those are really, I don't want to dismiss any of these other values at all. I think those are really important values. I think those values are in interesting ways in tension sometimes with values of care. And one of our problems is how could we deal with those, how could we deal with those tensions? So feminism has had this real back and forth over the years about thinking about care, because on the one hand, you want to be able to say, look, this is something that's been characteristically something that women have been doing, but they shouldn't be forced to do it. It's, limits their options in all sorts of other ways. So what should we do? Well, maybe we provide childcare or we do something like that. At the same time, it has been part of the tradition for women to pay more attention to care values. And I don't think that's something biological, but I do think that's been part of what happens in this cultural tradition, especially since you have this phenomenon where the more you take care of people, the more important care seems to be for you. So I completely agree that I think there's a genuine tension between those two values. And I think when you look at how policymakers, for instance, have talked about care, it's tended to be, well, care is instrumental for these other values. So care is instrumental for justice. So, it's good to have care available because it means that women are going to be liberated. Or care is instrumental for utility because, like someone like Jim Heckman would say, well, look, if you take care of your kids, they're going to grow up and they're going to be smarter and they're going to be a higher investment as a result. And that's a very common kind of narrative. Something that I think is really interesting to get back to the students and physicians is that, for instance, if you look at the mechanisms we do have for providing care, they're often sort of disguised as being medicine or education. So if you say, we should support childcare, you're much less likely to get support than if you say we're going to support preschool or we're going to support early childhood education. So kind of if you say it's instrumental, it's this thing that will make the children smarter, as opposed to they're children, you have to take care of them, right? That is a kind of way of smuggling care in. Or if you, a very interesting, vivid, recent example is Medicaid will pay for home health workers, Medicare won't. So Medicare will pay for a home health worker if you've got an order from your doctor that says you need to have this home health worker because you just got pneumonia, but they won't do it if you're a 90-year-old man and you need someone to help take care of you. So I think that's the sort of thing that seems to be missing. So often care is in the service or has been conceived of in the service of these other kinds of values, including justice. But I think care is one of these intrinsic human values by itself, and we don't give it its due if we're always thinking of it as instrumental to these other kinds of values, including justice, which is not to say that the other values aren't important.
Okay, so even in cases in which those frameworks of justice really push in the same direction or make recommendations for the same kind of policies, it's still viewed in a sort of instrumental way as part of the opportunities or preferences we might want to. And so that would be the issue here. Not necessarily that it's leading to different conclusions, but also that it's representing care in the wrong way.
I think that's right. And I do think, and again, I don't want to just be, romantic or sentimental about care. Some of the tensions that I pointed to are intrinsic in care. So if you think about justice, for example, if Thalo really wants to watch Paw Patrol, right? Am I impinging on his, part of me says, no, I'm taking care of you, Thalo, and watching Paw Patrol for 2 hours is not going to be good for you. Do I actually know that it's not going to be good for him? Probably not. I mean, there's some sense in which I'm exercising arbitrary power over the 4-year-old, but of course you have to exercise arbitrary power over a 4-year-old. So I think some of these relationships between when is it care, when is it power, when do you give up autonomy, When do you say, no, Dad, you can't have the car keys? I think those are really complicated and interesting. And one of my mantras about this is there's an intelligence of care that I think is also incredibly neglected. So there's a kind of intelligence that you have to have. Those are very cognitively, caring for someone is a very cognitively demanding kind of activity. It takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of thought. And again, when we think about intelligence, that's not a kind of intelligence that gets acknowledged in discussions about what counts as being human intelligence.
So we are running a little behind, so I hope it's okay if I still ask a couple of questions, but I'm going to go fast in the questions. So I wanted to really get into the policy aspect of this, and I guess I had two questions, which maybe I can ask in one go. That way we don't go over time too much. But so the first really is, I really like the grandmother example, the grandparent, the classroom grandparent example at the end, and also just this notion that just we need to recognize that care happens in a locality, and so if people aren't together, the care work can't happen in the same way. I mean, I remember my parents partly helping to look after a kid during COVID on Zoom, really, reading stories, singing songs, but of course it's a lot is lost. And so I wonder if it made me think really about the larger, almost policy agenda of age desegregation, whereby so many institutions that we've designed are segregated along age lines. That's true in schools even, where children are separated, in most schools at least, although some private schools do it differently for a range of reasons, but also thinking about the absence of children in those spaces where we talk about things that matter to all of us and to them, the lack of the fact that grandparents in many cases don't feel welcome in many contexts, and the fact that children don't feel welcome in many contexts and many spaces. So it seems like to me that it's pushing towards an agenda that's very ambitious in that way, and that's very promising. Yeah. So maybe you could say something about whether there are other examples you also explore. And then the other question is about the prospect of universal basic income, and even going further than child tax credits or family allowances, precisely because it universalizes a kind of caregiver model. And I know you don't necessarily want to go into, as you said earlier, it's not about turning all relations into relations of care, but nonetheless, there's this advantage to a policy like this, that first it encourages everyone to take up, to make more time in their lives for care work, because there is an income available that's independent of labor, and so you can rely on it to look after an aging parent that needs your help that particular year, and you need to take some time off work, or you might use it to choose a job that enables you to have more time in the evenings with your children. And in fact, the pilots that have been run everywhere, I mean, many of them show that parents are able to make different choices. They're able to take a different job. So even though nothing in the specification, it's unconditional. It doesn't say you need to spend more time with your kids. This is what they try to do. They say, now I can be home on time for dinner. I can read my children a story before bedtime, which I couldn't do before, right? So, but it also has the advantage of, and this is where it connects with gender justice, and it also has the advantage, because it's universal, of not further entrenching gender norms, where the risk would be with something that targets caregivers, that women withdraw from the labor market at higher rates than men, and so this idea of having a grant available for everyone has some advantages. So I guess those are my two last questions about policy. You can say whatever you want about them.
So I'll just, briefly before we talk. One thing that I didn't mention that I should have is older children in almost all cultures except ours. Ours is really bizarre that way, are involved and engaged in care from the time they're very young. So in most cultures, 4-year-olds are being taken care of by 7-year-olds, and 7-year-olds are being taken care of by 13-year-olds. There was a really dramatic example. There was a plane crash last year in the Amazon, and the 13-year-old kept all of the kids alive for a month in the jungle. And your thought was, gee, I don't think my 13-year-old could do that. But this was in the context of a 13-year-old who was used to the idea that she was taking care of younger sibs. So one thing that is something of a hobby horse of mine is by separating kids out, you keep them from learning how to do care, and you are losing a great resource of caregivers by themselves. But in general, I think the age desegregation is absolutely, a crucially important reform, and I think lots of people agree with that now. One of the interesting things is that post-COVID, and I think there's data about this, here was this thing that happened with COVID where suddenly generations were in the same house, where suddenly your grandfather was in the house, and then apparently lots of people have said, oh, let's keep that going, even though we don't have to do it because of COVID anymore. That's a really satisfying way of running our lives. So I'm completely on board with that. And I think the same thing's true with the universal basic income, is that that's one of the things that it could do. Although I do think it's interesting that I think there is some data that if you say, this is a family allowance, people will really spend it on their kids, right? Even though they don't need to, even though, I don't know, Ted Cruz or someone would say, yeah, they're going to go off and spend it on booze. They don't. They actually do spend it on care. And maybe having a sort of universal care allowance, which wouldn't necessarily be related to whether you have children or not, but would be, this is an allowance to let you care for the people around you and have it be explicitly that way, as opposed to just having universal basic income, but have it be universal would be, I think that would be a very good idea. And as I said, part of my thought with, say, extending marriage is you'd want to extend it so that it could be the friend, who doesn't have someone else to take care of them. And you could imagine being able to get resources to help you in those care situations. I think you're right that care is so universal that a universal basic income is going to lead to more care. But I also think the idea that it's not just another utility, right? It's not just another thing that you can spend money on, that there's something especially valuable about it is worth emphasizing.
Thank you so much. So I'll invite those of you who want to ask questions to stand here behind the mic and to ask your questions.
Thank you so much for this excellent presentation and excellent dialogue. There is this Declaration of Children's Rights, or the Rights of Children, which has evolved throughout the 20th century. Do you think it has had an actual impact? And if yes, what kind of impact? And especially in low and middle income countries?
Yeah. Juliana, do you have a better sense of that?
Not really. I mean, it's a really good question because, of course, there's the question of the centrality of care and why has care not been so central to all those frameworks. And then there's a question of children's interests and children's needs, which, of course, aligns to some extent, but to a great extent. But it can't be reduced to the question of children's rights, of children's interests, even though, of course, it's a critical part of it. So I don't know if you want to say something to
Yeah, I think
that.
Again, this is part of this interesting tension about, what's, given that this is a relationship where one partner has more resources than the other, you could say, well, why don't you just give the kids the resources, right? Like, why would you want to, or if you think about examples where this tension comes in, I briefly mentioned charities, right? I mean, the structure of a charity is that it's an institution that's designed to give resources from one group to another group because the other group needs the resources more. How do you keep that from impinging on the right of the person who's receiving the resources, right? So how do you keep cared for people from being manipulated or being in power relationships as a result of that care? And something like the children's rights has to figure out, how do you make that, how do you do that? How do you keep, I mean, obviously a fundamental right of children is to be cared for, but how do you balance that against their autonomy? And, as I say, I am willing to say that every single person who has ever had an adolescent child has faced this tension between what are their rights, what are their autonomy, and what do they need from me in terms of care, like every day in a horrifying, gut-wrenching. Maybe not. Maybe there's some teenagers who aren't like this, but it's a very fundamental, foundational kind of tension. So I think that's a really good question.
And talking about age disaggregation, it's very rare for children to come to talks like this.
Yeah.
And I remember once presenting on universal basic income, and there was a child in the room, and she came to see me at the end, and she said, "This is a really interesting idea. I like the idea of basic income. What about us? What about children?
Yeah,
Would we get an allowance on a monthly basis?" And it was very important to have that exchange.
Yeah.
So yes.
Hi, I'm Andrew. First, I want to say thank you very much for caring for humanity through your practice of science and what you choose to study. And my question is, a lot of people seem to hold a view that is somewhat cynical, somewhat well-founded, that people who care less take advantage of people who care more, and therefore caring is in some ways a form of weakness. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more, like more than what you've already commented on how we might make caring more adaptive from an evolutionary perspective rather than less.
Yeah. Well, I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, part of the reason I started with biology is we've got pretty good evidence that it's very adaptive from an evolutionary perspective, especially for humans. And a lot of I didn't talk about this, but I think there's a good argument that a lot of our cooperation, which is very characteristic of humans, is rooted in even the same, I don't want to quite say oxytocin, but it's rooted in the same kinds of neural mechanisms that our care relationships are like. So, we aren't just cooperating because there's tit for tat and reciprocity, which has been going back to Axelrod, that was the evolutionary story about why are we ever altruistic. But there's a very good case to be made that just that kind of altruism isn't going to actually be enough to get the kind of cooperation going that you need to get the kind of social institutions that you have in humans, or for that matter in wolves or any other kind of primates, any other kind of cooperative species. So, a just so story you could tell is that this set of emotions and feelings and motivations about a particular commitment to care for another person actually underpins this very adaptive strategy of cooperation, which otherwise tends to be undermined in exactly the way that you're talking about, tends to lead to defection if you don't have that, if you don't have that background. Way I like to put it sometimes is think about Bonnie and Clyde, right? So Bonnie and Clyde are classic prisoner's dilemma. They've been arrested. One of them is gonna snitch on the other one, and how do you decide? How do you get out of that prisoner's dilemma? Well, if they love each other, then they're not going to snitch on each other, right? If it's more important to Clyde that Bonnie thrive than it is for him, and vice versa, that's a way that you can get a kind of cooperative commitment that isn't going to be subject to the same kinds of issues of defection that you get in a kind of classic case. So,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It sounds like you may have briefly answered my question, but I'll be very brief, which is, what is the difference between care and beneficence or altruism? So it sounded as if, in the beginning, that there was an inherent inequality of resource or of power that was central to care that might not be the case with pure philosophical beneficence or altruism. So I'm just curious, just expand on the idea, what is unique or at the core about care that is is it a special form of beneficence or altruism? Is it a separate normative category in general? What's the sort of normative taxonomy that you put care in?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think worth thinking about what's the relationship between the ways that people have thought about altruism. But again, if you think about it from the modeling perspective, for instance, the typical story about altruism has been this kind of reciprocity story. So the story is the reason why you're being altruistic is because in terms of, the broad, or even if you have a story that says that's going to have maximal utilities for everybody, right? So if you behave altruistically in this circumstance, in the long run, people are going to have better utilities. But if you think about that mother who's taking care of the baby who has the plague, right? It's not clear that that's going to lead to better utilities for anybody, right? I mean, that, and I think an interesting example is you think about Peter Singer, who of course is the great, great advocate for altruism in a utilitarian context, right? Probably the greatest advocate for altruism that, in modern philosophy. One of the things that has been controversial about Singer is Singer says, if I'm consistent about this, no, you shouldn't be taking care of you don't have an obligation to take care of the terribly disabled child who's going to die in 6 months anyway, right? Do the utilities. That's not increasing anybody's utilities. And yet your care intuition is, no, that's exactly the case where you have the most moral obligation. So I think those are the kinds of examples that would discriminate between sort of beneficence and altruism. And Peter Singer is like a case study of the fact that those two things can be differentiated, at least philosophically. It's wonderful to have philosophers who are really consistent. That's what philosophers. The one thing that philosophers can do that the rest of us can't is really be consistent, even in the face of absurdity. That's their great gift, and I think that makes the difference particularly clear.
Thank you.
And it seems also that, if you think of the way the interests of a parent are entangled with the interests of a child, it would be very odd to refer to the kind of care they have for them as being just reduced to altruism. Right?
Yeah,
because
that's right.
Of course, the interests of your child becomes yours. You want your child to thrive just as much for yourself as for them to thrive. And so it's not, sometimes the interests can conflict and there can be some dedication, even when it comes at a great cost, but it would be too much to go the other way and think, it's a form of altruism. So in a way, that's why John Rawls had this head of families in the veil of ignorance, is because he didn't really know how to conceptualize it's clearly not in a way, it's as if self-interest could be understood as among the family structure, and within it, you couldn't really think of those individuals as individuals anymore.
I think one of the things that's interesting that I have in some versions of this talk is if you think about the classic philosophical approaches to ethics, right? Well, there's utilitarianism. Care doesn't fit very well with the utilitarian framework. There's Kantian universality, right? So you have these universal principles. Care doesn't fit very well with those either. There's a sort of Rawlian veil of ignorance, but that doesn't fit very well either because, knowing whether you're going to have a child or not is really, really important in terms of discriminating what your moral obligations are. So I think it's actually quite, and virtue ethics doesn't really get it. All the things that are the kind of classical ethical frameworks don't capture the things that I think are most distinctive about care, even though in everyday experience, these are the places where we have the deepest moral sentiments.
Hi. I know you've spoken at length already about when care turns into a power dynamic.
Right.
But the example I want to focus on more is about conservatorship and guardianship. So these families have this beautiful mission to care for someone who is disabled, elder, what have you. However, it strikes down their own autonomy, and it even veers into unnecessary martyrdom.
Yeah.
And so from a policy perspective, how do we not do that? I guess that's like a really simplistic way of saying that. But.
Yeah, there's my brilliant postdoc who's working on this with me was describing a word in Japanese, which of course now I can't remember, that describes the way that you can use your helplessness as a way of getting power. And again, anyone who's had a 4-year-old or an infant, knows about that. Probably anyone who's been married knows about that dynamic, right? So one of the things that I think is interesting is you can see that there's a kind of Dutch book implicit in that modeling structure that I gave you, right? Well, wait a minute, I have more resources, and because you're needy, I'm going to give you resources. I'll just go around being needy, and that will be a good way for me to actually get power, right? It's kind of like the power dynamic is reversed. And I think that is a genuine issue that comes up, and it's very relevant for gender justice too, right? So if women are in a position where they're feeling pressured to take care of the people around them, even though it's not reciprocal. In some sense, that's a classic case of care. But you can see how that could really undermine your, that could be an unjust relationship in various kinds of ways. So I think that's a really good point. And we see this in our, again, you think about something like the religious case or the foreign aid case. Are we actually really doing something to help this other country to thrive, or are we engaged in another kind of exchange that isn't characteristic of that? Are we really exercising power? I think those are all really important questions that come up, but that come up when you think about care in particular.
Thank you so much, both of you, for such an enlightening discussion. I wanted to ask about what seems like kind of a growing sentiment that companies, corporations, designers, developers ought to care for, like, the direct and indirect impacts of the things they put out in the world, the people that are impacted, the way that the environment, things like that are impacted. Now, given your apparent skepticism about expanding or extending the care relation more broadly, I'm wondering if you think that maybe there's a better approach to sort of beefing up responsibility in these cases than characterizing these relationships between, like, makers and consumers or whatnot as care relationships, or if you think maybe there's a different way that we can conceptualize those relationships, like the relationship between a designer and the world that they're shaping, or a designer and the person who might be affected by what they put out there.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really good question, and I think things like the natural world, which I just mentioned in passing, are really interesting examples of that, where you tend to think about environmental justice, for example, either as in some kind of utilitarian context, okay, if we mess up the parks, they won't be available to us, or else in a kind of, well, we just need to not have any kind of interference or intervention with, this part of the natural world. And I think actually in practice, there's Peter Godfrey Smith, a philosopher who used to be here, has a really interesting discussion of this in his latest book. If you think about, say, our relationship to non-human animals, it isn't just a relationship of utility. Well, we think that it would be good to take care of them. And it isn't even really quite just a relationship of justice, because we have a kind of power and authority about them. And I think that example, or the example of our relationship to the natural world, works better if we conceive of it as being a relationship of care than the way we usually conceive of it. And I think that might be an interesting case if you're thinking about things like being a designer or being a writer, or a much wider. I think there's a wide range of activities where there's an element of care that we typically don't pay as much attention to. So teaching, as I say, for those of us in the room, that's a really good example where we tend to think of it in terms of some kind of exchange, but very often it is in fact a relationship of care. And I think that would be true about, it's even true if you think about something like the way that you feel about works of art, right? The kind of impulse that you have that you should be taking care of them. And partly it's utilitarian, but partly it's just this sort of intrinsic sense that something that's got, that's complex, that has a structure, is something that you should be defending, or you should be taking care of. So I don't think it's just everything good is care, but I do think there are many, many contexts in which we could think about things from the perspective of care, and that would be an improvement on the way that we think about it in terms of utility or universalized principles.
Thank you.
A house is a nice example, right? Like, why, or a garden? Those are things that, part of the reason why being a gardener is so satisfying, and the title of my book about being a parent is The Gardener and the Carpenter. Gardens are a really lovely example of something that you do that just is intrinsically a relationship of care. You could go to the store and you could get the damn vegetables and it would be cheaper and it would be easier. Why is it important? It's because you've been waking up every morning and looking at those little tomatoes and trying to figure out what they need to thrive, and that relationship makes it really different than if you were just going and buying the tomatoes in the store.
I think we'll take the next two questions one after the other, so to finish.
We actually have all three of you
Okay.
ask your questions, and then Alison, feel free to answer, and Juliana, feel free to
And we can talk some more in the reception, yeah? Okay.
Sounds good. I was going to say 2, but 3 is fine.
Yeah, since we have three.
Okay.
Yeah. And we'll try to be
All right,
briefer.
so, yeah, thanks for a very thought-provoking talk. I was really struck by how we as humans have developed these very unique social institutions for care, but at the same time, many of the what we've built as a modern society, whether it's in our urban
Yeah.
planning or in our built environment or in our technologies, has socially isolated us, and locality is very primary for care, as you were mentioning. I'm just curious what your thoughts are about how we can kind of remedy that situation through what we build.
Yeah.
Let the next person.
Hey, Mike.
Sure. So was just thinking more about this definitional issue about care, because in the utility theory tradition of modeling our relationships with other people, there are many things where you take on somebody else's utility
Right.
that don't count as care, helping, informing, and so forth.
Right.
And that led me to think whether risk is a fundamental part of the definition of care. It's taking on somebody's utility
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
in cases
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
if you did not, in certain ways, the counterfactual risk is incurred. And that's
Huh.
the COVID example that you gave. Well,
Yeah,
how could I
right.
not, how could I stop caring? Same for the garden and so forth.
Yeah. That, as usual, Mike, that's brilliant. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. There's also an interesting piece, which is, I had wanted to mention going, sorry, let's do the third question. and then-
I'm so curious of the answer to that.
Yeah.
Maybe you could answer that.
Yeah, I was going to mention with autonomy, I don't know if I mentioned it, go back to those rats, right? You know, what the mom's doing with the rats in the maze is giving them an opportunity to take risks, which they wouldn't be able to do otherwise if they weren't in that kind of safe environment. So it's not just that you're adding the utilities, which would be telling the rats, stay away from that maze, don't go anywhere near there. It's also giving them the opportunity, it's also buffering the risks that they're going to take. And I do think that's a big piece of what happens with care, both with children and I think with students, with you know, when you tell your students to go to the Berkeley-Stanford conference to do their first talk, because that's not going to be as scary as if they're doing the talk somewhere else. That's part of your, you know, that's part of your care. That's part of your care relation, sort of independently of what the utilities of it are going to be. That's a very interesting thought.
Maybe I'll just, like, if we don't have time to answer, maybe I'll just kind of ask you so we can all think about it, because you mentioned about intelligence and what is the definition of intelligence.
Right.
And I think, like, my personal just observation over these years with the intelligence and the definition of artificial general intelligence has
Right,
been really
right.
focused on like reasonings, math,
Exactly.
which I think are really important, but I think at the same time, like how can we imagine something like artificial caring agents that are maybe not giving you the answer, but empowering you to like figure out the answer, or like
Yeah.
autonomous, like giving you the autonomy to know how to differentiate different sources of answers. And I wonder, like, how would you imagine that kind of agent, and how would you even evaluate such abilities?
Yeah. I think that's also a really good point. And I had just the one slide, but I've been thinking a lot about care, both in terms of what we would do to care for AI systems and ways that AI systems could be involved in care. And, you know, there's a big industry now about, we're going to have, you know, robots go do all of our elder care for us. And what would it mean to actually have an artificial system that was, you know, even just in your ordinary interactions, was doing something that was like a kind of care. And there's some interesting empirical work that people like Anke Dragan and multi-agent modeling are doing to try to describe what would it mean for an artificial agent to be able to do that. One thing that I wanted to mention that was relevant to both of these questions is that Max Kleiman-Wiener, who's one of the people coming to our workshop, has made a really interesting point, which is that care often has this kind of temporal character, which makes it different from other kinds of relations, where the thought is, if you're caring for someone, part of the thought is, their utilities are going to be improved even if you're not there. So it's not just that you're improving their utilities, but you're setting up a situation in which their utilities are going to improve even if you're not there anymore to provide resources or help with their utilities. And that's, again, sort of part of the autonomy picture. So part of what you're doing with your kids is you're thinking, there's a point at which I'm not going to be able to give you resources anymore, so I want to spend them now so that you'll be able to, you'll be able to figure out what it is that you're going to, what it is you're going to be able to do for yourself. So if you listen to Winnie the Pooh instead of watching Paw Patrol, then in the future, you are going to be able to access the whole world of literature when I'm no longer there determining what it is that you're listening to. That's probably a confabulation and rationalization, but I think that temporal aspect is actually really important and interesting and makes care different from other kinds of relations.
Wonderful. Well, it's going to be time for drinks and food, but before that, please join me in thanking Professor Gopnik.
Thank you, Juliana.